There we go. We are recording. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to host, Crash to Cellar webinar again. It's our number four webinar, and today our guest is Darren Michaels. So, Darren, thank you very much for participating to Crash to Cellar webinar. You are with Scott Laboratories. Can you introduce yourself?
Hey, yeah, I'm Darren Michaels. I work for Scott now, outside technical fermentation expert. There's too many words to the title. The least part, my favorite part is the expert. I don't like that part of the term, but, and yeah, I've been in the business, the wine industry since 2001. I left Scripps Immunology, working on vaccine research, mainly for HIV and stuff. And then I jumped into different kind of fermentations. I was doing coli fermentation, batch fermentation. But I worked at Sutter Home as a wine chemist, enologist. And then I took over the Vinquery, the now past, in its passing Vinquery lab. When they had a Santa Maria lab, I was running that for a number of years. And then I went over to Terravant. I was director of enology and winemaking there. And then I jumped ship and worked at LaFleur for a little while as a technical rep. And now I am up in the Pacific Northwest working with Scott and supporting wine and non-wine. Got a couple cider guys, well, more than a couple. Cider guys, some kombucha guys, some mostly wine guys though that I help. People, not just guys, people. And that's where I find myself now. So I'm in Lisle, and which is not near Hood River, and it's finally got warm enough that we can.
Great. So Darren, that was my second question. You know,
it's been nice, but not super hot.
So with COVID-19, I ask always that. The question is, where are you? What is your surrounding? You know, with COVID-19, everybody is at home right now. Most of the people are, and so it's interesting to know where you are, what you do, what is your surrounding, right?
Yeah, okay, so I am in my garage because we have two big Great Dane bloodhound mixes that are very loud. So I have a tendency to go out the garage, and I tell people it's my parents' basement, but it's actually not my parents' basement. And it's been like everyone else, you know, we get to go walk outside. You know, I'm in a rural area, so we don't really have to deal with too many people. But it's been interesting because, you know, the amount of support I've been able to do has been much higher per day because I can float. So I'll have a meeting in France, like in the morning, or in Spain. And then I will jump over to a meeting in Petaluma. And then I'll jump over to a meeting in Texas. And then I'll jump over to a meeting in Washington and Oregon. So it's been quite an interesting experience. Now, I've been going crazy a little bit because I'm used to seeing people like a normal human being. The Zoom thing is fine. But one thing that has been very interesting is to see the overlap of, I mean, when you go from one meeting to another, from like Spain to Texas to California to Washington to Vermont, you know, Canandaigua, you start to see patterns that are very conserved. And that's been actually a very interesting way to do it. And, you know, quite frankly, to drive and travel 2 or 3 hours a day is just not a hugely efficient use of my time. So, but I am available anytime.
Well, that is important to remind everybody that you are, yes, available to answer questions or technical questions. This is really your role at Scott Laboratories. So anybody who have question about any product, you are, you know, very knowledgeable, and feel free, everyone, to contact Darren directly. If you want his direct contact, you can send me an email and I will be happy and pleased to forward his contact information. So we decided to talk about enzymes today. Enzyme is a very powerful tool to know, and I'm so glad you accepted this invitation. So the concept of a webinar with Crash to Cellar is to be very practical. You know, we don't need 2 hours of slides to understand a concept or a product, but I think it's very important to to know the how and why and how it works and how winemakers can use that product and what result of that product can bring to the winemaking protocol and process. So 10 questions, this is the concept. I will ask you to answer 10 questions and then go directly to the point, and we will be super focused. And this is the concept of a Crush to Cellar webinar. So first question number one, why does anyone use enzymes?
You know, it's a good question. And like I said, it's one that is asked by, you know, anywhere from smaller producers to actually really big producers. And you can imagine when you go from, you know, 5 tons or 10 tons to 600,000 tons, costing gets very, very important, you know, especially if you're at a lower price point. But when you're talking about why enzymes are used, it's very actually pretty specific. It's specific and it's not. It really is used, and it's one of the only enological products that pays for itself because you use it to maximize your fruit value, increase the yields from that fruit, and then a lot of times, well, most of the time, is to minimize losses. And, you know, part of that is like so driven by, I mean, the quality is so driven. The fact of the matter is most phenolic compounds and aromatic compounds and precursors are in the skin. And I'd say 60 to 70%. If you're making white or rosé winemaking and you're just using the pulp, if you're just crushing and pressing and using the pulp, now given the crushing will probably give you a little bit more, but the time frame, there's a good chance you're actually be throwing away a lot of the aromas and flavors when you press off of them. So it's unusual in that way, as the wine industry is, when you compare to other fruit processing, because they wouldn't dream of throwing away so much flavor in other processes. But in this process, there's so much. And if anybody knows, and it's one of the first times I was out working at Sutter Home years ago, and I didn't know anything. What I did start to notice is that the white skins that were being pressed and thrown away as pumice actually smelled and tasted really good. And I was wondering, like, why are we not sourcing? It turns out they use enzymes. That's a big thing, because if you're throwing away, and unless you're going to make grappa, which I don't recommend, I've made grappa, it's awful, you're literally throwing away the flavor. That's for whites and rosés. For reds, it's much more of a targeted processing. Now, it's funny because folks really do a lot of natural processes, natural winemaking. And we have a little winery in Lisle that we do natural winemaking in, for the most part. One thing I do like to use, though, is enzymes, because they are natural. They're perfectly natural. That's why they're legal to use. And they're not produced, I mean, the ones that we produce at Scott, they're not GMO-produced enzymes. So they're all from Aspergillus niger. Anyways, in red winemaking, the reason why I use them is because I want to get all the stuff I want out before pressing away from the stuff that I don't. And so, like, if I want all the color and the flavor and the aroma, but without too much, I might use Lauzyme EX. Use that, it's taking away the color and the aroma out. And then I don't want a lot of that bitter and astringency. So I'll press, I won't have to wait for it to show up. If you're going to be doing a larger production, which is not so applicable in Oregon, but if you've got a lot of tanks you need to turn around fast, you absolutely have to use enzymes, because in some facilities, like up here, we're turning tanks 5-6 times a harvest, and you cannot expect a proper extraction in that time frame. So, and you don't want to heat your fermentations too hot because you'll affect your yeast. So you add the enzyme to get all the stuff you want out of it, the color, the pigment, the flavors, and then you press away from it. So in that case, you're basically, all you're doing is speeding up a process fast enough so that you can then remove from the bitter or the drying astringencies. I mean, believe me, I have a client up here that does a 9-month extended maceration. You know, they put all the fruit in there. They don't need enzymes at that point. It's been sitting in there for 9 months. But I tell you, when you come into July and you smell that stuff that they're pressing right before harvest begins, the wine that comes out of it is undrinkable. They only use a little bit of it. You know, they don't really use a whole lot of it. It tastes and smells like pumice. So they use a little bit in a lot of their blends, but they're a big winery that can do that. But honestly, for the vast majority of production, they have to use an enzyme because they don't have the time or space to do that. So that's really why they do it. You're basically maximizing fruit value, increasing the yields, and then minimizing losses by, like, you know, helping with filtration and stuff. And
Okay,
you know, when you go ahead, sorry.
Question number 2, what is an enzyme and how does it work? Okay, so
enzyme's pretty easy. You know, it's just a protein, but it's catalytic protein, and that just means that it just starts or speeds up a reaction, and that's it. They're usually pretty specific. There's one substrate and one reaction, and their activity remains until you run out of substrate or you stop it. And in the US, winemaking, you can only use enzymes that are from either Aspergillus or from Trichoderma. There's a couple other bugs out there, molds, that they can source, but on a practical production basis, most of the enzymes you can use in the vast majority of enzymes, yeah, it's just basically a protein, a catalytic protein, and that's all it does.
okay. So not only we have a lot of different enzymes on the market, but we have a lot of different vendors as well. So how a winemaker need to choose what is the right enzyme for the purpose?
Well, there's, like you said, like there's a lot of choices, and that's, you know, with too many choices, people have a tendency to not to make any choice at all. Mm-hmm. It's good to understand that because intrinsically an enzyme prep is a natural prep that, and it comes from mold activity, which is specified to be okay as part of the winemaking process. It's very important. What I feel nowadays is to make sure that what the enzymes you're using are how they're sourced, or at least the person that's telling you knows how they're sourced, and if they work as intended. We go into a little bit about fruit processing enzymes, which years ago, that was the first enzyme used in the wine industry, to very, very negative results. And we'll get into why that is. But it's really important for people when they look at all these enzymes to understand that the supplier, or more importantly, like at Scott Labs, directly with the manufacturer, that the source of the enzymes stay consistent. Now, a lot of suppliers buy enzymes in bulk, and then they process and change the enzyme formulations based on how cheap they can buy the enzymes. It's real important, like at Scott, to source your enzymes from people that they know are manufacturing consistently the same enzyme. That when you buy a bottle of sin-free this year, it'll be the same as the bottle of sin-free next year. And to make sure that that is the right enzyme for what it's intended to do. So, for instance, they use the right media, they produce the right activities, and those activities, and liquid enzymes especially, have a lot of side activities. And a lot of times, you get a better outcome with yield and with processing and with quality if you have the right side activities. You know, you get a spec sheet from an enzyme producer or seller, and it says it's got pectinase in it. Well, that's just a spec sheet. It doesn't tell you actually all the other side activities. And honestly, they might not list all of them because they don't even know them. But with like a good manufacturer or good suppliers, you kind of know what those side activities are. For instance, like in red wine making, you want a lot of cellulase, you want to get all the good stuff out, but you don't want any anthocyanases in there, at least not early in the process. You actually can denature color or break down color, unfortunately. Like Color Pro is well known in the industry, and honestly in the enzyme supplier industry, because it is such a consistently producing enzyme. And then for white wine making, it's like cinnamon esterase. You got to kind of watch out for that. But there's a lot of choices. And the bottom line is you have to oftentimes trust what your supplier is telling you, that they've done the work to show that that enzyme is actually working in red wine or white wine and not just a fruit enzyme, and to make sure that the dosage is going to match what you want out of it. But that's really it. You got to trust your supplier. You got to know where they're sourcing from, and you got to make sure, first of all, is that the enzyme that they're recommending for it? If you use the clarification enzyme as example, and then you use it as a pressing enzyme, you might get way too much tannin out of what you don't want, to give you an idea. I hope that answers your question.
So we have yes, absolutely. We have a lot of questions, you know, often say, when do you put the enzymes in? Do you put that at a crusher with the SO2? Does SO2 affect the enzyme's activity? You know, that is the question who come often.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, when we talked about it being a catalytic protein and that it's just, it starts or speeds up, it remains there until it either runs out of substrate, and in wine, you're probably not going to run out of too many substrates, except if you use the right enzyme. Or you stop it, okay? The only two ways to really stop an enzyme irreversibly is to heat your wine or juice up to 170 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very unusual unless you're doing flash, very high flash for that matter. Or you add bentonite. You don't need a whole lot of bentonite to stop an enzyme, and it doesn't remove the enzyme. It just affects its tertiary structure. So enzyme has a primary structure with amino acids, and then those start to fold in. They have a secondary structure, which starts to build a form, and then those fold in again, and they come into a tertiary structure. And that tertiary structure is where their enzyme activity comes from. The bentonite irreversibly destroys that structure, okay? Now, there are other things, though, that can affect that tertiary structure, and that is very, very high level of SO2, and a very, very high level enological tannin.
Okay.
So it's important that when you're using sulfur in your juice especially, that you don't mix your sulfur. But you need a lot of sulfur before you start to affect your tertiary structure. So you won't have an issue unless you are like adding the sulfur at 500 or 300 parts per million at the same time mixing with the enzyme. You should be fine at normal dosages. Enological tannins, yes, they're known to bind some proteins, but those are very large proteins, like grape proteins, like when you use a tannin for sacrificial tannin. You really need a lot of enological tannin before it affects the tertiary structure of an enzyme. And here's why we know that. Because if you don't do anything and you just crush the fruit, it's got a lot of tannin there and it's got a lot of enzyme activity just simply because of the process. It doesn't have enough to really speed your process up. That's why you got to add a little more, but it doesn't do anything in the activity. Same thing with SO2 as with enological tannins. Don't just mix them together. You don't want to add them all together and just spray them out. You do want to separate the dosage. In our handbook, we recommend 6 to 8 hours. Honestly, I don't think it's necessary. But you definitely don't want to just pile on enological tannins into your enzyme solution.
So to be practical, you prepare a different, product. Your SO2 in one bucket. You prepare your tannins in another bucket. You prepare your enzymes in another bucket. And when you crush, you add as you go in your. So you put a little bit of SO2, you crush a couple of half a ton, and you put a little bit of tannins, and you crush half a ton, and you put a little bit of enzyme, and you should be okay.
Yes, you should be okay. If you want to give me permission to share, I will show you what I'm talking about.
Please, yes, absolutely. Can you share? I'm not sure.
Not right now. It just says I am unable to share because the host is disabled.
Okay, so I'm not sure how to.
You can right click and make me a co-host if you like. I'll show you guys really quick. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, when you're making your wine, you don't have to stress too much about it. I mean,
okay, you are host now, so you should be able to.
Okay, cool. Okay, let me show you this thing. I'm just going to show you my view of my presentation. So can you just see the enzyme template, correct? So here's the enzyme production. We're going to talk a little bit about that. But here's what we're talking about when we talk about tertiary structure. So what are enzymes? Protein structure. So you got your primary structure. I mentioned it's a chain of amino acids, usually about 100 amino acids. Then secondary structure is when you start to fold that together because of the charge on those amino acids. And then you get specificity on the enzyme. That's the tertiary structure. You even have sulfur bridges in those structures. So high SO2 starts to affect your tertiary and quaternary structures when you have a multiple combination of those things. There's also a couple of other things that will affect it when we're on this topic. Outside of picking the right enzyme, okay, I want more aroma without tannin or without phenolics, so I'm going to use sin-free on my skins. Okay, I got the right enzyme now. Wow, what do I do? Then you got to pick your dose, temperature, and time. Once you've picked the right enzyme with the right activities, then you got to keep aware of that. The success of that enzyme is based on dose, temperature, and time. Now, the doses as recommended by our suppliers and manufacturers and us, because we do the trials and the research to get that done, they're usually pretty close to what you want to do and get your ideal outcome. But watching your temperature, making sure you're at least 45 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit is a pretty good idea. Now, the temperature won't kill your enzyme, but it will start to retard that activity. So if you let it warm up, it'll start working again. If you're doing flotation and your juice is coming in real cold, use clear extreme. It starts to work at 40 degrees Fahrenheit. But as it starts to heat up, it really starts to work. And then for time, you can accommodate that temperature time with you can compensate sometimes the temperature with dose. Very few enzymes can go that low, like Clear Extreme does. But you can accommodate even the lower temperatures with an increase in dosage. But all the success, whatever enzyme prep you're using, it's always the same. It's dependent on dose, temperature, and time. And those are the things. And unless you heat that juice up or wine up to 170, 180 degrees Fahrenheit, or you add bentonite, which you don't need any very much at all to do it, your enzymes will continue to work.
Okay.
I hope that answers your question.
Yes, absolutely. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay,
can you hear
good.
Me?
Because I thought I had a problem with my microphone. I got a message and they said that it was not working anymore. So glad that you can hear me.
Oh.
Okay, good.
Good.
Yes. Do I need to worry about cinnamyl esterase?
Cinnamyl esterase. Okay. You're hearing a lot about that one right now.
Huh? In conversation as well. We have that question coming often. So tell us.
Yeah. Okay. Here's the deal. Let's make it really quick. Cinnamyl esterase is an enzyme in combination with cinnamyl decarboxylase activity from the fermenting yeast may produce off flavors, typically when that is combined with a POF or phenolic off flavor yeast strain. In reds, not so much an issue. In fact, it's found to actually help certain, it doesn't produce any real Brett compounds, I've realized, but what it does do is help with color strategy. So you don't have to worry too much about cinnamyl esterase in reds. But in whites and rosés, generally it can be a problem because if you use a POF positive strain and just ask your supplier if it's a POF positive, but the vast majority of white and rosé strains nowadays are POF negative with phenolic off flavor producer. If you have enough cinnamyl esterase in your enzyme prep, you run the risk of producing some of these vinyl phenol aromas, and you might not produce enough you can smell them directly, although sometimes you can smell clove, but you also absolutely can start to produce enough to start masking your flavors and aromas. Now that's the bad news. Yeah. The bad news is that yes, cinnamyl esterase is something that it needs to be somewhat aware of. The good news is that Scott Labs doesn't produce any enzymes that has enough to really be a problem. If you really don't want any cinnamyl esterase, you can use sin-free, which is a liquid enzyme. It's okay. Now, there are a couple enzyme companies out there that I happen to know, because I've seen the numbers, are producing enzymes that are used in the winemaking. They're offering in winemaking that does produce way too much cinnamyl esterase. Now, those companies are most likely just buying bulk fruit enzymes and then just selling to us, okay? Now, some of the other suppliers, they have to dry their enzymes to remove the cinnamyl esterase. Thankfully for us and at Scott Labs, any of our manufacturers, we only use two actually, they both produce enzyme preps in such a way that the liquid or the dry has very, very low cinnamyl esterase. And you can do that. You just pick the right Aspergillus niger strains, you feed it the right food, and it produces no cinnamyl esterase. So none of our enzymes that you buy from us will have enough, especially for ones targeted for white or red. But if you really do think you want to worry about it, then just use sin-free. And sin-free you can use to increase your yield in your pressing and also for settling, if you're really concerned by it. And that is a liquid enzyme, not purified. It is just produced in such a way that it has no sin-free, has no cinnamyl esterase. But yeah, I mean, with Scott Labs enzymes, you don't have to worry about it. But it's enough to ask to see if what they do have, and some folks do make a big deal about it because they're paying the money to dry their enzymes so that they don't have any cinnamyl esterase. But at least with our enzymes concerned, you don't have to really much worry about it, especially for the whites or the rosés. But it's a good question. It's out there. It's out there.
Yeah, it's there. We heard about it, and then so. Different form, different enzyme. We have powder, we have liquid. What are the differences between the powder, the liquid? What is the most efficient? What do you recommend?
Well, I will say this. Historically, the liquid enzyme business in the wine industry in the world has been driven by the US. The US, more than even Europe, preferred liquid enzyme production. So a lot of the liquid enzyme production produced for the US, you know, mainly starting with Scott Labs, is because people want to use liquid enzymes. And they're good. You know, you just got to be careful on how you source them, because like I mentioned before, if it's not the right liquid enzyme, you're going to get too much cinnamon esterase or some other things that aren't going to work too well. Now, because of I mean, we started selling enzymes, liquid enzymes, what, 30 years ago? I mean, a long time ago. And because of the demand and the concerns about cinnamon esterase, we had to find producers that got the activities we wanted. And for the most part, for us, there's not much of a difference between our liquid and our dries, except for when it comes to specific activities like glycosidase activity. Now, DSM or Enobrands is where we offer, that's the manufacturer we use, and Enobrand sells Revelation Aroma. They are the source for glycosidase for a lot of other companies. So those are the companies. It's a dry product because you want a purified glycosidase activity. And then sometimes, like with Lauzyme Cuvée Blanc, it's a pressing enzyme meant to express aromas, and the glycosidase activity is also in there and it's emphasized. So that is a dry product. But for at least our products concerned, the way they produce, well, for us, there shouldn't be a difference between our liquid and our dries. And that's because if you look at this chart here, when you talk about enzyme production, there you do this autolysing, you go through these processes, but when you get to the end, there's actually, before you get to dried, you actually get the liquid version. And then the liquid version is generally dry. Now, some enzyme producers, like I said, need to purify their enzymes because otherwise their enzymes will do bad things in your wine. So they only can offer dry versions of them because they have to be purified as cinnamon esterase, for instance. But because manufacturers produce liquid enzymes that have low activity to begin with, we don't really need to do that. And that's just from design from the beginning. So enzymes like KS and stuff, we could do a dry formula if people really wanted it, but we don't really need to because the liquid is actually closer to the natural product than the dried is. So actually, ironically, the dry products sometimes cost a little more in processing to get. But liquid enzymes are not rehydrated dry products. It's the opposite. It's the opposite.
Okay.
The dry products are actually dried from the liquid products. But all of our Rapidase line, like we have Clear Extreme, we have that in a powder form. If people really wanted it, we could go back and get the original liquid form if they really wanted the liquid form. I mean, I myself, I like dried, especially if you're making if you're not making as much wine, because the liquids do need refrigeration and the dried products have a tendency to last longer just overall. In fact, liquid enzymes last about 24, 36 months. And then granulated enzymes typically last 36 to 48 months. And so, honestly, it's really up to you. I mean, if I'm a smaller winery, I prefer the enzymes that are dried, but dried or liquid, you're going to have to dilute it with water. If you pour in the liquid without dilution, it just pours to the bottom of the tank. The liquid is about dispersion.
Okay,